3 years ago, my wife Valentina dropped a bomb on Thanksgiving that destroyed everything I thought I knew about my family. I'm finally ready to tell this story because honestly, the way it's all unfolding now feels like something out of a twisted movie. I was 29 then, married to Valentina for 4 years. We'd been together since college, and I genuinely thought we had a solid relationship. Sure, we had our issues like any couple, but nothing that seemed insurmountable. My cousin Kyle had always been the family golden boy. Better looking, more charming, always seemed to land on his feet no matter what stupid decision he made. Growing up, I was used to being in his shadow, but as adults, I figured we'd moved past all that competitive nonsense. Thanksgiving morning started normal enough. Valentina was in the kitchen working on side dishes while I prepped the turkey. My parents were hosting at their house like always, and Kyle was supposed to bring his latest girlfriend. The whole extended family would be there. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, the usual crowd of about 15 people. Around noon, Valentina walked into the dining room carrying the turkey on a platter. She'd put sunglasses on it, which seemed weird, but I figured it was just her trying to be funny. Everyone was already seated and chatting when she cleared her throat loudly. She announced that she had a surprise for everyone, especially me. Then she launched into this speech about how she'd been unhappy for months, how I never really satisfied her needs, and how she'd found someone who actually knew what to do with his hands. The whole room went dead silent. I'm sitting there trying to process what's happening when Kyle walks in from the kitchen, shirtless, with this smug grin on his face. He looked right at me and said he was sorry, but Valentina had made it clear that he filled the plate better than I ever could. The sexual innuendo wasn't lost on anyone. My own mother started laughing and said it was about time someone in the family knew how to please a woman. My grandmother chimed in that my grandfather had the same problem and never could satisfy anyone properly. The worst part was my father's reaction. He just shrugged and told me I should have seen it coming because I was never much of a man anyway. The entire table erupted in laughter and agreement. 15 people who were supposed to be my family. People I'd spent every holiday with my entire life, and they were all in on this humiliation. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds taking it all in. Then, I very calmly poured gravy on my plate and told them they'd all be back by Black Friday begging like dogs. More laughter, more mockery, people calling me a loser and saying I was delusional. Here's what they didn't know. I'd been planning for something like this for years. Not this exact scenario, but I always had this feeling that Kyle would try to take something important from me eventually. He'd been doing it our whole lives with smaller things. I'd spent the previous 2 years quietly documenting every family financial arrangement, every loan my parents had given Kyle, every business deal he'd messed up that my father had bailed him out of. See, our family has money. Not rich exactly, but comfortable. My grandfather built a successful construction business that my father expanded. Kyle had been given multiple opportunities to prove himself in the family business and had screwed up every single one. Meanwhile, I'd been working my way up at a competing firm, building my own reputation and client base. After the Thanksgiving disaster, I didn't storm out or cause a scene. I finished my meal, helped clear dishes like nothing had happened, and drove home alone. Valentina stayed with Kyle at my parents' house. That night, I started making phone calls. The first call was to my business partner, Jeffrey, at our firm. We'd been discussing breaking off and starting our own company for months. I told him it was time to pull the trigger. The second call was to 3 of my father's biggest clients who I'd been building relationships with for years. The third call was to my lawyer. Within a week, I'd moved out of the house Valentina and I shared, started divorce proceedings, and put our business plan into motion. I knew exactly which clients were unhappy with my father's company's recent performance and exactly which projects Kyle had mismanaged. These weren't stolen clients. These were relationships I'd built independently. Kyle had convinced my father that he could handle the Morrison account, which was worth about $200,000 annually. He'd been promising them a renovation timeline that was completely unrealistic and had already missed 2 major deadlines. I'd been watching this train wreck develop for months. The day before Christmas, Jeffrey and I officially launched our new company. By New Year's, we'd secured 4 major contracts, including the Morrison account. Kyle's incompetence had made the transition seamless. We didn't even have to badmouth the family business because the clients were already frustrated. But here's where it gets interesting. About 6 weeks after Thanksgiving, I started getting weird texts from Kyle. Nothing dramatic or apologetic, just random messages asking how I was doing, if I wanted to grab drinks. I ignored them all. Then Valentina started calling from numbers I didn't recognize. I let them all go to voicemail. The messages got increasingly frantic over the next few weeks. Kyle's latest text said something about Valentina being impossible to live with and asking if we could talk. Valentina left a voicemail crying about making a huge mistake and wanting to work things out. Meanwhile, my business was exploding. We'd hired 2 additional contractors and were booked solid through the summer. Every success felt like vindication, but I wasn't ready to celebrate yet. I knew this was just the beginning. My mother called me in March, and I actually answered because I was curious what she'd say. She started off trying to act like nothing had happened, asking why I'd been avoiding family gatherings. When I reminded her of Thanksgiving, she got defensive and said I was being dramatic about a little family teasing. That's when I realized they genuinely didn't understand what they'd done. In their minds, they'd just been having fun at my expense like they always had. They couldn't comprehend that this time was different, that there would be real consequences. The divorce finalized in April. Valentina tried to fight for alimony and half the business value, but I'd been smart about keeping my new company completely separate. She walked away with basically nothing except the house, which she couldn't afford on her own. By summer, Kyle's relationship with Valentina had imploded spectacularly. She'd apparently been cheating on him too, with some guy from her yoga class. The family business was struggling because they'd lost several major accounts and Kyle's project management skills hadn't magically improved. That's when the real begging started. I'll update soon with how this all played out because, honestly, watching them scramble has been more entertaining than I ever expected. And for those asking in the comments, no, I'm not interested in forgiveness or family reconciliation. Some bridges deserve to stay burned. Update 1. Holy crap, you guys! The response to my last post was insane. Thank you to everyone who shared their own family horror stories. Makes me feel less alone in this mess. And yes, to answer the most common question, I'm absolutely not taking any of them back. Some bridges don't just get burned, they get nuked from orbit. So remember how I mentioned Kyle and Valentina's relationship imploded? Well, it gets so much better. Turns out Valentina wasn't just cheating on Kyle with yoga instructor guy. She'd been running up credit card debt that Kyle somehow got stuck with. The details are fuzzy, but apparently she convinced him to co-sign for something and then maxed it out before disappearing with Yoga Dude to Colorado. Kyle came crawling back to my parents' house in July, broke and humiliated. This is where it gets interesting because suddenly the family golden boy isn't so golden anymore. My father had to face the reality that Kyle had lost 3 major clients in 6 months and basically tanked a quarter of their annual revenue. The first real contact came in August. My mother showed up at my office unannounced while I was meeting with a potential client. She waltzed into the reception area like she owned the place and demanded to speak with me immediately. Jeffrey handled it beautifully, told her I was in an important meeting and she could schedule an appointment like everyone else. She waited in the lobby for 2 hours. When I finally came out, she launched into this speech about how families should stick together, and I was being childish for holding grudges. I let her talk for about 5 minutes before I asked her point blank if she remembered what she said at Thanksgiving dinner. She actually tried to gaslight me, claiming it was just harmless joking and I was being too sensitive. I told her that her idea of harmless joking had cost her family business several major contracts and a son. She got flustered and started backtracking, saying Kyle was having a hard time and maybe they'd been too harsh. Too little, too late, Mom. But the real desperation started showing in September. Kyle began texting me directly, not the casual stuff from before, but long rambling messages about how sorry he was and how he'd made a huge mistake. He claimed Valentina had manipulated him and he never meant to hurt me. Classic Kyle. Everything was always someone else's fault. The texts escalated over several weeks. He'd send these paragraphs explaining how the family business was struggling and how my father was considering selling. He kept emphasizing how we used to be close as kids and how he'd always looked up to me. Pure manipulation. But it gave me insight into just how bad things had gotten for them. Then came the phone calls. Kyle would call at weird hours, sometimes drunk, rambling about how he'd screwed up his entire life. During one particularly pathetic call in October, he told me Valentina had completely destroyed his credit, his confidence, and his relationship with our parents. He said my father barely spoke to him anymore, and my mother spent most of her time complaining about how I'd abandoned the family. The best part was when he tried to blame me for their business problems. He actually said that if I hadn't started my own company, their clients wouldn't have had anywhere else to go. I reminded him that those clients left because of his incompetence, not my recruitment. The Morrison project alone was 6 weeks behind schedule when they fired his company. Around Halloween, my father finally swallowed his pride and called me directly. This conversation was fascinating because he tried multiple approaches in a single phone call. First, he attempted the authoritative father routine, telling me it was time to stop this nonsense and come back to work for the family business. When I laughed at that, he switched to guilt tactics about my mother being depressed and Kyle being in therapy. When neither of those worked, he got desperate and offered to make me a partner in the family business with Kyle. 50-50 split, he said, like we were equals. I told him that ship had sailed the moment they all decided to humiliate me at Thanksgiving. He actually had the nerve to say I was being unreasonable and that families forgive each other. The conversation that really revealed their desperation happened in early November. My grandmother called me, which was shocking because she'd been one of the worst at Thanksgiving. She started crying almost immediately, saying she was sorry and that she'd been thinking about what she said for months. She claimed my grandfather would be ashamed of how she acted and that she missed having me at family dinners. But here's what made it obviously calculated. She mentioned multiple times how lonely my mother was and how the family business was struggling without me. Even her apology was really just another manipulation attempt to get me back into the fold. The breaking point came last week when Kyle showed up at my apartment complex. He'd been drinking and was sitting on the steps when I got home from work. He looked terrible. Lost weight, messy hair, clearly hadn't been taking care of himself. He started this whole speech about how he'd been in love with Valentina since college and how he'd been jealous of me for years. This was the first honest thing Kyle had said to me in decades. He admitted that he'd been competing with me our entire lives and that taking Valentina was supposed to prove he was better than me. He said watching my business succeed while his life fell apart made him realize he'd never actually been better at anything. He'd just been the favorite. The conversation lasted over an hour, with Kyle going between apologizing and making excuses. He told me Valentina had been complaining about our marriage for months before Thanksgiving, and that she'd basically seduced him. He claimed he thought he was rescuing her from an unhappy situation. When I pointed out that a rescue doesn't require public humiliation, he broke down completely. He admitted that the whole Thanksgiving spectacle was Valentina's idea because she wanted to hurt me as much as possible. She'd convinced him that I'd try to win her back if they didn't make the rejection absolutely brutal. The most pathetic part was when he asked if we could start over and be brothers again. He actually suggested we could be business partners and combine our companies. I told him he'd burned that bridge so thoroughly that even the ashes were gone. Kyle left that night looking completely defeated. But I knew this wasn't over. They're all getting desperate enough to try more dramatic gestures, and honestly, I'm curious to see how far they'll go. Because here's the thing they still don't understand. I'm not the same person they humiliated at Thanksgiving. I've built something real, something successful, something they can't touch or take away. And watching them realize that has been better than any revenge I could have planned. The holidays are coming up again, and I'm betting they're going to make one last desperate play. I'll keep you posted because this is getting wild. Update 2. You guys, I cannot believe what just happened. Remember how I predicted they'd make some desperate play during the holidays? Well, they absolutely delivered, and it was somehow both more pathetic and more infuriating than I expected. First, let me catch you up on what's been happening since my last update. My business partner, Jeffrey, and I landed another major contract in November, a residential development that's worth more than my father's entire annual revenue. Word travels fast in our industry, and apparently this news made it back to my family pretty quickly. Kyle's texts became daily after that, not just apologies anymore, but actual business propositions. He kept suggesting we merge our companies, with him handling the family relationships and me handling the actual work. The audacity was incredible. He genuinely thought I'd want to partner with someone who'd publicly humiliated me and then ran his own projects into the ground. But the real escalation started 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. My mother began what I can only describe as a full-court press campaign. She started showing up at places she knew I'd be. My gym, my favorite lunch spot, even outside Jeffrey's office. Each time, she'd try a different approach. During one particularly ridiculous encounter at the coffee shop near my apartment, she brought photo albums from our childhood. She sat at the table next to mine, loudly reminiscing about family memories and holidays we'd shared. When I got up to leave, she followed me to the parking lot asking why I was throwing away 29 years of family love over one bad day. I told her it wasn't one bad day. It was a lifetime of treating Kyle like the golden child while I was the backup plan. She tried to argue that they'd always loved us equally, which made me laugh out loud. I reminded her that when Kyle crashed his car in high school, they bought him a new one. When I crashed mine, they told me to get a job and buy my own. The conversation got heated when she accused me of being jealous and vindictive. She said I was punishing the whole family because I couldn't handle Kyle being more successful with women. I pointed out that Kyle's success with women had landed him broke and alone, while my supposed failures had led to a thriving business and genuine self-respect. That's when she played her trump card. She told me my father was having health problems and that the stress of the family falling apart was making it worse. Classic manipulation tactic, and I told her so. She got angry and said I'd become cold and calculating, nothing like the son she'd raised. The week of Thanksgiving, the pressure campaign intensified. My grandmother called crying about how this would be the first Thanksgiving in 60 years without the whole family together. Kyle texted me photos of the table set up, showing my usual spot still set with my name card. Even my Uncle Scott reached out, trying to play mediator and suggesting we all needed to move past this for the sake of family unity. But the absolute peak of their desperation came on Thanksgiving morning. I was enjoying a peaceful breakfast at my apartment when my doorbell rang at 8 a.m. I looked through the peephole and saw my entire family standing in the hallway. Parents, grandparents, Kyle, even a few aunts and uncles. My father was holding flowers. My mother had what looked like a homemade apology cake. Kyle was wearing a suit like he was going to court. They'd clearly coordinated this intervention. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. My father immediately launched into this speech about how they'd all made mistakes and how family was more important than pride. He said they'd been wrong to embarrass me and that they wanted to make it right. My mother jumped in talking about how much they missed me and how holidays weren't the same without me. She was actually crying real tears, which would have been more effective if I hadn't seen her turn the waterworks on and off my entire childhood. But Kyle's contribution was the most telling. He admitted that everything he'd achieved in life had been handed to him, while everything I'd accomplished had been earned. He said he'd been living in my shadow professionally for years, and that the Thanksgiving humiliation had been his way of trying to feel superior for once. The conversation lasted almost an hour, with each family member taking turns explaining how sorry they were and how much they needed me back. My grandmother talked about legacy and keeping the family together. My father offered me full control of the family business if I'd come back. Here's what they still didn't understand. This wasn't about business or money or even forgiveness. This was about respect. For 29 years, they'd treated me like the responsible backup son while Kyle got to be the charming favorite. They'd enabled his failures, celebrated his mediocrity, and expected me to clean up his messes. When I finally spoke, I told them exactly that. I explained that their apologies rang hollow because they were motivated by desperation, not genuine remorse. They weren't sorry for how they'd treated me. They were sorry that their golden boy had crashed and burned, while their backup plan had succeeded beyond their expectations. Kyle tried to interrupt, claiming he'd genuinely learned from his mistakes and wanted to be a better brother. I asked him point blank if he would have called to apologize if Valentina hadn't left him broke and humiliated. His silence was answer enough. My father got frustrated and reverted to his old authoritative tone, telling me that enough was enough and it was time to stop being stubborn. That's when I knew they still didn't get it. Even in their apology, he was trying to order me around like I was still the obedient son who'd accept whatever scraps of affection they threw my way. I told them I appreciated the effort, but that some things couldn't be fixed with cake and flowers. The damage wasn't just the Thanksgiving humiliation. It was decades of being treated as less important than Kyle. They'd shown me exactly how they really felt about me, and I believed them the first time. The most satisfying moment came when my mother asked what it would take for me to forgive them. I told her that question proved she still didn't understand. This wasn't about them earning forgiveness. This was about me choosing not to waste any more energy on people who'd never valued me properly. They left looking defeated, but I could see the anger starting to creep in. My father's parting shot was that I'd regret this decision, and that family was all that really mattered in the end. Kyle muttered something about how success had changed me and made me heartless. I spent Thanksgiving alone by choice, working on plans for our next business expansion. Jeffrey texted me photos from his family dinner, and seeing actual healthy family dynamics just reinforced how toxic mine had always been. The crazy part is that I think they expected their grand gesture to work. They genuinely believed that showing up as a group with apologies and flowers would make me forget years of being treated as the lesser son. The entitlement is staggering, but I'm curious what comes next. They've played the guilt card, the health scare card, and the grand gesture card. They're running out of manipulation tactics, which means they might finally accept that this is permanent, or they might get nastier. Some of the looks they gave me when they left suggested they're starting to view me as the villain in this story rather than the victim of their own behavior. Either way, I'm prepared. 3 years of building my independence wasn't just about business success. It was about becoming someone who couldn't be manipulated, guilt-tripped, or controlled by people who'd never truly respected me. The best revenge isn't getting even. It's building a life so good that their approval becomes irrelevant. Final update. It's been almost 6 months since my last update, and I figured I owed you all a final conclusion to this saga. A lot of you have been messaging me asking what happened after the Thanksgiving intervention, so here's how everything ultimately played out. After they left my apartment that morning, things actually got quiet for a while. No more surprise visits, no more guilt-trip phone calls, no more manipulation attempts. I thought maybe they'd finally accepted that I was done with their toxic dynamics. I was wrong. They were just regrouping. In January, I found out through mutual contacts in our industry that my father had been spreading rumors about my business practices. Nothing actionable, Just subtle implications that Jeffrey and I had stolen clients through underhanded tactics. Classic move. If you can't compete legitimately, try to damage your competition's reputation. The rumors didn't stick because our work speaks for itself, but it showed me that their desperation had turned into genuine hostility. They'd moved from seeing me as the prodigal son who needed to come home to viewing me as a traitor who'd betrayed the family. Kyle's approach changed too. Instead of pathetic apology texts, he started sending bitter messages about how I'd destroyed our family for the sake of my ego. He claimed I was punishing everyone because I couldn't handle losing Valentina to him. The projection was incredible. He was the one whose ego had driven him to public humiliation, but somehow I was the prideful one. My mother's strategy was the most insidious. She started reaching out to mutual family friends and distant relatives, telling them her version of events where I'd abandoned the family over a harmless prank. She painted herself as the heartbroken mother whose ungrateful son had cut contact over nothing. Some of these people actually called me to try to mediate, which gave me the opportunity to tell the real story. When I explained what actually happened at Thanksgiving dinner, most of them were horrified. A few even admitted they'd always noticed Kyle got preferential treatment growing up. The breaking point came in March. Jeffrey and I were celebrating landing our biggest contract yet, a commercial development worth more than my father's company had made in the past 2 years. Word got back to my family quickly. That evening, Kyle showed up at the restaurant where we were having our celebration dinner. He was drunk and angry, and he made a scene that got us all thrown out. He screamed at me in the parking lot about how I'd stolen his life, how the clients should have been his, how I was nothing without the family name. The mask had finally come off completely. This wasn't about family reconciliation anymore. This was about Kyle's inability to accept that I'd succeeded where he'd failed. He'd spent his entire life being told he was special, and watching me thrive while he struggled was destroying his self-image. That incident was actually liberating because it confirmed what I'd suspected all along. Their attempts at reconciliation had never been genuine. They just wanted me back in the role of dutiful backup son, cleaning up Kyle's messes and supporting his failures. But here's where the story gets really satisfying. Over the next few months, the natural consequences of their choices started accelerating. The family business lost 2 more major clients who got tired of Kyle's incompetence. My father had to lay off 3 employees, including his longtime foreman, who'd been with the company for 15 years. The stress was clearly getting to him. I heard through industry contacts that he'd been making increasingly desperate decisions. Kyle's personal life continued its downward spiral. He'd been living with my parents since Valentina left, and apparently that arrangement was not going well. My mother complained constantly about having her 30-year-old son back in his childhood bedroom, and Kyle resented being treated like a failure. In May, I heard that Kyle had gotten into a relationship with someone new, a woman named Marion, who worked at a local restaurant. According to mutual acquaintances, he was already repeating the same patterns, making grand promises he couldn't keep, living above his means to impress her, setting himself up for another spectacular failure. The most telling moment came in July when I ran into my grandmother at the grocery store. She looked older, more tired, and when she saw me, her whole demeanor changed. She didn't try to guilt me or manipulate me this time. Instead, she just looked sad. She told me that family dinners weren't the same anymore, that Kyle was angry all the time and my parents spent most meals arguing about money and blame. She said she finally understood why I'd stayed away, that watching the family dynamics without me there had shown her how toxic things had really become. That conversation helped me realize something important. My absence hadn't just removed me from their dysfunction, it had forced them to face the reality of their relationships without having me as the responsible one to blame or rely on. By September, I heard through the industry grapevine that my father was seriously considering selling the family business. Without the clients they'd lost and with Kyle's continued mismanagement, they simply couldn't maintain profitability. Meanwhile, Jeffrey and I were thriving. We'd expanded to 8 employees and had a waiting list of potential clients. We'd built something based on competence and integrity rather than family connections and favoritism. The final confirmation that this story was truly over came last month. I was at an industry networking event when I saw my father across the room. He looked older, defeated in a way I'd never seen before. When our eyes met, he just nodded once and looked away. There was no anger in that moment, no manipulation attempt, no dramatic confrontation. Just the quiet acknowledgement that we'd both made our choices and were living with the consequences. A few people have asked me if I feel guilty about how things turned out for them. The honest answer is no. I didn't destroy their family. I just stopped enabling it. I didn't ruin their business. I stopped cleaning up Kyle's mistakes. I didn't abandon them. I chose to prioritize my own well-being over their dysfunction. The 3 years since that Thanksgiving dinner have been the best of my life. I've built a successful business, developed genuine friendships, and learned what it feels like to be valued for who I actually am, rather than what I can provide for others. Sometimes people ask if I'd do anything differently, and the answer is that I wish I'd had the courage to set these boundaries years earlier. The only regret I have is wasting so much time trying to earn love and respect from people who were never capable of giving it. To everyone who followed this story and offered support, thank you. Reading your comments and messages helped me stay strong when the manipulation attempts got intense. You reminded me that healthy families don't operate the way mine did, and that I deserved better. For anyone dealing with similar family dynamics, my advice is simple. You can't change people who don't want to change, but you can change how much access they have to your life. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst behaviors. I'm done updating this story now, not because there isn't more to tell, but because I've finally reached the point where their drama is truly irrelevant to my happiness. That, more than any revenge I could have planned, feels like the real victory.